Hi, this is Debbie, and today I have a tutorial for split coat stampers, which I'm also sharing here on my blog and YouTube channel, but you can find the original tutorial at splitcoatstampers.com. One of my favourite ways to add more impact to a watercolour piece is to go in after the watercolouring with some pencils to add more detail and in particular more shadows. I'm going to be using this Merci Beaucoup set from Clearly Besotted Stamps with this beautiful rose image, and I'm going to white heat emboss that on some Archer's hot press watercolour card. I've placed the watercolour card inside the Mini Misty, treated it with EK Success powder tool to prevent any embossing powder sticking where I don't want it to, and then stamped it with Versamark ink, making sure to give it a really good press down to get the best impression. I'm then giving the piece a really good sprinkle with some white embossing powder from Simon Says Stamp and tapping off any excess before tidying up any stray embossing powder that may have stuck down where you don't want it to with an old paintbrush. I've got my heat tool really good and hot before bringing it to the powder to melt it. Now that I'm ready to watercolour, I've taped the card down to a piece of board, and this will prevent it warping when I add water. I'm going to prime the card with a good wash of water over the whole area. This will provide a good base for my watercolouring. I can always go back in and add more water later if it's needed, but this will be a good starting point. One of my favourite watercolours in my palette is this Daniel Smith Quinacridone Coral, which is just a perfect pink for flowers. While my watercolour card is still slightly damp, I'm bringing in some of the coral into the deepest shadows where the petals would overlay one another. So where one petal is overlapping another, you would naturally get a deeper shadow, and I'm starting by adding the pink to those areas. The watercolour is gently moving out through the wash of water that I laid down originally, but some areas I'm going to give a little bit of a help with a damp brush to soften the edges. I'm going to speed this video up now, otherwise it would take too long to watch. I really enjoy my watercolouring. I love sitting down the colour, watching it move through the water, adding more colour, adding more water, building up the colour, building up the depth, and taking my time. I really enjoy just pottering around with my brush and spending a few minutes to enjoy the process. I think having the right tools can make watercolouring easier. They certainly don't have to be expensive tools, they just have to be the right ones for the job. I found having the right watercolour card can make a huge difference to my watercolouring. Having a piece of card that holds the water long enough so that you can get that beautiful result where you add the watercolour to the water and it gently moves through the water to get beautiful watercolour results. To achieve that, you really need to have a card that's going to stay wet for long enough. And although I've got all these beautiful watercolours, if I had to spend my money in just one place, it would be on the watercolour card. Now that I've got a simple base of pink for the flower and green for the leaves, I'm starting to bring in some different colours and some deeper colours, and this will add dimension and make the flower look more realistic. As we are approaching the changing season, I wanted to mute the colours of this rose down slightly. I wanted it to appear like it was a late summer rose rather than the bright colours of earlier in the season. Keeping those more muted autumn tones in mind, I wanted a background, but I didn't want a bright blue of summer, so I've chosen a creamy beige colour and I'm adding that around the leaves and the flowers and then blending it out with lots of water. I'm adding dots of colour in the same pinks and greens that I used for the original flower. I'm adding those dots to the background and letting them blend out. And this will give the impression that there's some out of focus flowers and leaves behind the one that's in the forefront. I've dried the watercolour with a heat tool and then added some paint splatters for interest. And once those are dry, I can then peel back the blue tape. When a watercolour is wet, the colours are more vibrant and deeper than they are once the watercolour has dried. Now, you can go back in and add more layers of watercolour, but sometimes I think that can overwork the watercolour and you lose some of the beauty that watercolour is with all those softly blended edges. And so recently, instead of adding more watercolour layers, I've been using pencils to add more details and shadows. I add a line of pencil in a colour that tones with watercolour and then blend that out with Gamsol on a paper stub. In the same way that I do with watercolours, I add the pencil detail to the shadows first and then blend those out. And I'm also adding some tones of the colours that I liked in the watercolour. I really enjoyed the yellow colour that I added to the leaves, and yet once that dried I felt it had lost it slightly. So I've gone back in and added some yellow pencil and blended that out. To finish the pencil details, I'm going in with some really dark colours in just one or two places, a couple of places on the rose, a couple of places on the leaves, and again just finishing off by blending those out with the paper stub with Gamsol. For the card base, I've cut and scored a piece of Nina Desert Storm card to give a card base which is 5.5 by 4.25. For the watercolour card, I've trimmed the piece down to 3 by 5.5 inches and then wrapped that round several times with some jute twine and tied into a bow. I should have done this next part before adding the twine, but that's hindsight for you. I'm adding a gentle blend of some distress inks around the edges using a Mini Ranger ink blender and some antique linen distress ink. and that again will mute things down and just give that sort of soft autumnal feel. Now moving on to the sentiment, and I've got the Message Me set from Clearly Besotted Stamps, and I'm placing the Happy Birthday sentiment onto some lollipop card from Basil in the Mini Misty, and again I'm going to stamp that in Versamark ink and white heat emboss. I've trimmed out the sentiment and now I'm going to cut a ribbon end into the sentiment banner. I do that by adding a little snip and then cutting in at the diagonal from the corners. Although this lollipop card from Basil was the best colour match I had in my cardstock to the colour of the rose, I did feel it was still slightly brighter in tone, and so I took the paper stub that still had some of the pencil that I'd used to colour the rose. I took the paper stub and just gently rubbed that around the edges of the banner, and that will mute in the tone slightly. I've added lots of foam adhesive both to the back of the watercolour piece and also the sentiment strip, and then I'm using my grid mat to help me line that up straight. Once I'd added the sentiment strip with foam adhesive, all that was left to do was to add some embellishments, and I chose some sequins and some rhinestones and then kept those in place with some Ranger Multimedium in matte. And that completes this watercolour card with pencils used to add details and shadows after the watercolouring. I'll leave links to the products that I've used in the YouTube description below, along with a link to my coordinating blog post over at limedoodledesign.com. If you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you'd subscribe to this channel. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.